Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. In between my longer conversations with people who fascinate and inspire and challenge me, I share a short personal reflection, a focused episode that brings you the ideas, stories, questions, ponderings, and perspectives that animate conversing and give voice to the purpose and heart of the show. Thanks for listening with me. Communication is a miracle and not a frequent one. That conviction has really shaped me because it's arisen out of my experience. Again and again and again, the whole world is supposedly trying to communicate. And again and again and again, we fail. And we spend endless communication meetings talking about the failure of our communication. And we have endless conversations about the way that news media, the internet, et cetera, miscommunicates. And we have marital disputes over a failure to communicate. And we have parent-child disputes over a failure to communicate. And what I'm getting at is it's so complicated. There's so much about communication, which is multi-layered and multi-dimensional. And we get some of it and we understand the words, but we don't understand the tone, or we don't understand the body language, or we're not really understanding the context, or we're not really understanding the purpose of the communication. And all of that just contributes to this wild, crazy collision of expectations, dynamics, capacities to understand, abilities to be able to engage, to get over miscommunication, to move back again toward communication. But often it's over the course of having to undo miscommunication. So it's often communication that doesn't start neutrally. It starts in a hole, and you're trying to dig your way out of it because communication is a miracle and not a frequent one. Why is it that we live in a world where we spend so much time trying to communicate, and yet the miracle of communication actually occurring, where what I or someone else wants to say to me is actually articulated or expressed in whatever appropriate way, verbally, non-verbally, and otherwise, and received by the person as the full message that we intend to deliver? Why is that so hard to accomplish? And I do think there's lots of reasons that contribute, but the reality of it is something that I think we all know in our bodies, whether we like it or say it or not. We just know that in many ways the stakes are against us when we're really trying to communicate. And sometimes at the most important times that we're trying to communicate, when something really significant is on the line, and might be straining to get our words or our messaging clear, and still it can land on deaf ears, or it can be lost in translation, or it can seem to be something that it's not. Part of it is communication just has so many levels to it. It has to do with our ears. It has to do with our eyes. It has to do with our body. It has to do with the atmosphere in the room. It has to do with the lighting. It has to do with the emotions, the other sounds that might be resonating in the room at the same time. All of these things contribute to a sense that time is another factor. Just the time that we take to communicate will often say a lot about our success or failure rate. It's not true that the more time we spend, the better we are, but it's also definitely not true that the less time we spend, the better we are. So in a speedy, text-driven glance at a communication, listen to part of the message, catch the end of the sentence and think you've understood and known the whole sentence when you haven't, and on it could go, in just demonstrating how far we are from really adequately listening to one another. And that is another sign of how much we need to communicate and how much listening is going to be a part of it, but then how much our communication in return is meant to be a securing of that effort of communication that doesn't have to be kind of brutal in its words, like, I heard you say, and now I am saying to you. The value of that architecture that is often introduced in communication courses is that those are the questions that that really do matter. We don't want to be mechanical in how we convey those things. But in fact, if you've said something important to me, I need to acknowledge that I've heard that message and received it. And if it's something sensitive, something complicated, something that's that's maybe said in vulnerability, something that's said in a weak moment or with anxiety, then all the more do we need to slow down and make sure that we're actually hearing and then responding that we're hearing. But the world is pushy. The culture's pushy. The sounds around us are pushy and demanding. They simply move us in momentum-like ways that cause us then to not really, in a way, be still enough, clear enough in our spirit, in our mind, in our heart to actually hear and receive and respond. When I watch people who are what I think of as expert communicators, they are people who have this quality that they hear well, they listen deeply, and they know what kind of communication to give in return that actually seals that was fully received. One of the important things about communication that we've heard from probably many, many different sources is how important it is for communication to have a loop that gets closed, that the person who's communicating says something, writes something, whatever it might be. We acknowledge the receipt of it. If necessary, we say more about the depth of how well how fully we've received it, and we close that communication loop. This is a constant thing. And I think my laxity often is I am an acute listener. I do try to listen as hard and deeply as I can. And I don't always close that loop in a way that I think is required. And with people that know me well, they know that weakness in my communication style. So they're not expecting the miracle that Mark Labberton will always close the loop and that it will be a sealed deal. They can easily and understandably assume then, perhaps, that I didn't hear it or I'm not going to weigh it importantly or whatever it might be. That's my problem, not theirs. So if I'm seeking the miracle of communication, then I have to live into the responsibility of closing the loop of communication and not just being a passive recipient of what it is that's been said or written or whatever it might be. That loop closing in communication is part of why we can measure the infrequency of communication, because frequently when we do say what we've heard and the person says, no, that's actually not what I was saying. I was not trying to say that. I was trying to say this. And then again, we test it. Did we get it the second time or the third time? It may take sometimes a lot of trying to get to clarity. But when we get the clarity, then we know, okay, I got it. We can now say of each other, I spoke, you heard, and the conversation or the relationship or whatever it might be can much more fruitfully move ahead. That's the miracle of communication. But the frequency with which we have to re-clarify, or where communication breaks down for a lack of closing the loop or a lack of enough effort to either speak or to receive, is part of what makes it such a mess and such a challenge. Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.